Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling something really fundamental. It's about understanding, well, pretty much anything that involves information. We're going deep into this idea of findings in research. Now, I know what you might be thinking sounds a bit dry, maybe academic, but hang on, think about it. If you really want to get to grips with information, maybe for work, a personal project, or just because you're curious, understanding what counts as a finding is like a secret weapon.
It really is.
This isn't about turning you into a PhD overnight. It's about getting a much sharper view of how knowledge actually gets built and shared.
Absolutely. And we're really zeroing in on that core concept findings. Our mission today, you could say, is to pull out the key principles from our source material on how research discoveries should actually be reported.
Right.
And the source we're using really hammers home this crucial link between how you do the research.
The methods.
Exactly, the methods and what you ultimately discover and share. By the end of this, you should have a much clearer sense of what a real finding is and, how solid research really depends on clear, answerable questions.
Totally. We're aiming for those aha moments where you suddenly see the difference between, say, a really solid study and something that's, well, maybe less convincing. We'll look at how research gets structured around central questions and that really critical difference between brand new discoveries and just, rehashing what's already known.
And the ethics involved, too.
Yes. Ethics, communication, it's all in there. So let's dive in. When researchers talk about findings, what exactly are we talking about? What is a finding?
Okay, so at its most basic level, findings are simply what you discover. They're the direct results that come out of the specific research methods you decided to use.
Okay, direct results.
Yeah, and here's the crucial part. These findings must relate directly back to the central research issue. The main question or problem the whole study was designed to explore in the first place.
Ah, okay. So it's not just sort of random, interesting facts the researcher stumbled upon during the process.
Exactly. That's a really important distinction. The findings section isn't the place for, say, personal stories or even summarizing previous research you read. Those might go elsewhere in the report.
Like the literature review, maybe.
Precisely. But the findings section itself is reserved for reporting what this specific study, using these specific methods, actually uncovered about that central issue. It's the new knowledge generated right here.
Got it. It's like saying, okay, we did X and Y, and this is what we learned because of it.
That's a great way to put it.
And our source material really stresses that this section, the findings, it's not just an add-on. It's like a cornerstone, right? Especially in big projects like a thesis or dissertation.
Oh, absolutely. It often forms the very core of the research report. Sometimes it's one big chapter, sometimes it's broken into several, but it's substantial.
Right.
It's where all that new knowledge, the stuff generated by the methodology to answer the main question, is laid out clearly and usually in quite a bit of detail. Often it ends up being the longest part of the whole document.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we know what they are. Findings are the core discoveries. How are they usually presented? Is this like a big data dump? Here's everything we found.
No, definitely not. Or at least it shouldn't be. There's a logic to it. The best way, really, both when you're planning the research and when you're writing it up, is to organize the findings based on your original research questions or your hypotheses if you use those.
Ah, okay. So those questions you set out at the beginning, they guide how you structure the findings.
Exactly. Think of them as the framework or like guideposts. Each question or hypothesis often becomes its own main section, maybe even its own chapter.
Makes sense.
And then within those sections, you might use subheadings to break down the details further, especially if you're tackling a complex issue. This structure really shows how the findings connect back to everything else, the purpose, the methods. It's all meant to fit together logically.
You've mentioned this central research issue a few times now. Why is that concept so vital when we're talking about reporting findings? What makes it the guiding star?
Well, it acts like the ultimate filter. It's the deciding factor for what actually belongs in the findings section. You might uncover all sorts of, fascinating side notes or interesting details during your research.
That happens all the time.
Right. But if those details don't directly help answer that core question or shed light on that central issue you defined at the start, then they really don't belong in this report's findings. They might be great starting points for a different study, but for this one, you need to stay focused. The central research issue keeps the whole thing on track.
That sounds quite disciplined. Why is that focus so critical?
It really comes down to research integrity. And our source brings up the ethical dimension here quite strongly.
Okay.
You have an ethical obligation, really, to report all the information you found that is relevant to that central issue, even if, and this is key, even if it contradicts what you initially thought or hoped you'd find.
Ah, right. So you can't just cherry pick the results that make your hypothesis look good.
Absolutely not. Withholding relevant data just because it's inconvenient or unexpected, that's a serious ethical problem. It completely undermines the credibility of your work.
So even if the data says my brilliant idea was, well, wrong, I still have to report that.
100%. That transparency is what makes research trustworthy. Think about it. If everyone only published results that confirm their hunches, our collective understanding would be incredibly biased and, frankly, wrong most of the time.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So, okay, those research questions or hypotheses, they clearly drive the whole thing. How do they actually shape the discovery process itself? They're not just organizational tools, are they?
No, not at all. They're fundamental. The whole reason you choose certain methods, surveys, interviews, experiments, textual analysis, whatever it is specifically to answer those questions or test those hypotheses.
Right. The methods match the questions.
Exactly. So, your methodology is designed around the questions. Therefore, logically, the findings you get from that methodology should be presented as the direct answers or results related to those questions.
So when I'm starting out drafting a proposal, my questions kind of sketch out the areas where I expect to find something. The categories for findings.
Precisely. In a proposal, your questions suggest the main categories you'll likely organize your findings under later. But there's a really important caution here from our source.
Oh.
At the proposal stage, you shouldn't really be predicting the specific findings beyond those general categories. Saying, I expect to find X, Y, and Z can introduce bias right from the start.
How so?
Well, it might unconsciously lead you to look for evidence that confirms X, Y, and Z, and maybe ignore or downplay anything that doesn't fit those expectations. It can really compromise the objectivity of the study.
Ah, I see. That's a subtle but important trap to avoid.
It is. But then, when you get to the final report, the emphasis shifts. Now, your ethical duty is absolute thoroughness. You must report everything you discovered through your primary research that directly addresses those initial questions or hypotheses. Whether it confirms your expectations or completely refutes them, it all needs to be there.
Okay. Now, what about building on previous work? You mentioned not putting summaries of old research in the findings, but surely past studies play some role.
Oh, definitely. Prior research, what our source calls precedent research, is crucial, but its role is mainly to provide a context or a theoretical framework for presenting and interpreting your own new findings.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Let's say you're researching leadership styles in a specific organization. You might use, say, Clinton's leadership emergence theory, an existing framework, to help categorize and explain the patterns you observed in your interviews or surveys.
So you use the old theory to help make sense of your new data.
Exactly. It provides a lens, a structure for discussion. But, and this is the crucial point the source makes, you cannot present Clinton's theory itself or findings from other studies about it as if they were your own discoveries in the findings section.
Right, that would be.
Plagiarism, plain and simple. You're reporting your findings using existing frameworks for context, not reporting the frameworks themselves as findings.
The source had that example about McGavran and homogeneous units, didn't it? How does that illustrate the point?
Yeah, that's a perfect illustration. Imagine your research question is about how Donald McGavran developed that specific concept in his own writings over time. McGavran's actual books and articles, those are your primary sources. What you discover by analyzing those texts constitutes your findings. Now, you'd almost certainly also read what other scholars have written about McGavran's work.
Secondary sources.
Exactly. Those secondary analyses can be really helpful. They might give you ideas for how to categorize McGavran's arguments or points to look for, but you absolutely cannot take their conclusions or their analysis of McGavran and present it in your findings section as if you discovered it directly from McGavran's texts.
Got it. Primary data yields findings. Secondary sources provide context or comparison.
You've nailed it. And this applies across fields. The source mentions theological studies, too. If you're analyzing a book of the Bible.
The Bible text is the primary source.
Right. Your findings are what you uncover from analyzing that text directly. Commentaries by theologians, those are secondary. They offer valuable perspectives, interpretations, historical context.
But they aren't your findings.
Precisely. They help you understand and frame your analysis, but the findings must come from your engagement with the primary source. Writings about something are not the same as findings from that something.
Okay, that distinction is really clear now. So findings must emerge directly from the research methods used. Let's talk more about that connection methodology as the source.
Yes, it's absolutely direct and inseparable. Whatever methods you choose, surveys, interviews, statistical analysis, historical research, textual criticism, your findings section reports what those specific methods yielded.
And you might use more than one method.
Oh, very often, yes.
Yeah.
Especially in fields like missiology, which the source mentions, researchers frequently draw on multiple disciplines. You might use aeological analysis, sociological surveys, maybe some anthropological observation, historical context.
All focus on that central research issue.
Always. And the findings section needs to present the relevant data gathered and analyzed through all those chosen methods. Relevance, again, being judged by whether it addresses that central issue.
So if I did surveys and interviews, the findings section needs to cover results from both.
Correct. And interestingly, the source points out that sometimes the real breakthroughs come when you integrate the findings from those different methodological streams.
How so?
Well, looking at survey data alongside interview quotes might reveal nuances or connections you wouldn't see if you just looked at the numbers or the stories in isolation. It allows for a richer, more holistic understanding.
Makes sense. Synthesizing different kinds of evidence.
Exactly. But just to reiterate, because it's so important,
Yeah.
what doesn't belong here are things like unsubstantiated opinions, random thoughts, or findings pulled from some other study that used different methods on a different population.
Yeah.
Stick to what your research produced.
Right. And what about quantitative data, like statistics?
Those absolutely belong in the findings. If you ran statistical tests, the significant outcomes of those analyses need to be reported. You don't just give a vague impression. You present the key figures, the statistical significance, things like that.
Okay.
Now, the source does add a practical note. If you have mountains of detailed statistical tables or raw data, putting every single number in the main body might just overwhelm the reader.
Right. You could lose the main message.
Exactly. So in those cases, it's perfectly acceptable, even preferable, to put the highly detailed, less critical tables or outputs in an appendix. Then in the findings chapter itself, you summarize the key results and just refer the reader to the appendix for the exhaustive details if they want them.
Okay, provide the essential proof in the findings, but keep the really dense stuff accessible elsewhere. That seems practical.
It is. It balances rigor with readability.
Now, let's clarify some terminology. We hear findings, but also conclusions and recommendations. Are they basically the same thing, just different words?
Oh, absolutely not. And keeping them distinct is really important for clear research reporting.
Okay, so what's the difference?
Think of it like building a logical argument. The findings are your evidence. They are what the data showed, what the analysis revealed, raw facts, observations, results.
Just the facts.
Pretty much. Then the conclusions are your interpretation of that evidence. They answer the so what question. Based on these findings, what does it all mean? What larger insights can we draw?
Okay, evidence first, then meaning.
Right. And finally, the recommendations answer the now what question. Based on the conclusions you've drawn from the findings, what actions should be taken? What are the practical implications? What should happen next?
Findings lead to conclusions. Conclusions lead to recommendation.
Exactly. Our source uses a great little test. After you state your findings, you should be able to logically write, therefore, and then state your conclusion. The findings provide the premise for the therefore.
Ah, I like that. Findings, therefore conclusion.
Precisely. And because of this logical flow, the findings section itself needs to be kept clean. It should be completely free of words like should, ought, therefore, this suggests, or we recommend.
Why is that separation so critical? Why not just blend them?
Well, a couple of reasons. First, think about how people read research. They might read the abstract, look at the research question, and then maybe jump straight to the conclusions or recommendations to see the bottom line.
Yeah, I do that sometimes.
Right. So if you've mixed your conclusions into the findings section, it makes it really hard for the reader to follow the logical thread. They can't easily see what's evidence versus what's interpretation. It gets confusing.
Okay, clarity for the reader. What's the other reason?
It also relates back to the research process itself. If you start drawing conclusions and making recommendations while you're still presenting the raw findings, it can sometimes indicate that you haven't fully stepped back yet, that you haven't systematically looked at all the findings together as a whole before drawing those broader interpretations. It can sometimes signal a less rigorous final analysis.
Okay, so keeping them separate maintains both reader clarity and demonstrates analytical rigor. Makes sense.
Definitely.
So we've got the structure, the connections. What about some general principles for actually reporting these findings effectively, beyond just organizing them?
There are several key principles our source highlights. First, and we touched on this with ethics, is the responsibility to report all relevant results, both the positive ones that support your ideas and the negative or unexpected ones that don't.
Don't hide the inconvenient truths.
Exactly. Sometimes, honestly, those unexpected results, the things that make you go, huh, turn out to be the most significant discoveries in the whole study. So embrace the surprises.
Good advice. What else?
Second, accuracy and understandability are paramount. You need to report things correctly, obviously, but also in a way that your intended audience can actually grasp.
Right, it's not useful if no one understands it.
Precisely. And the source notes that while deliberate lying with data is hopefully rare, readers can still be misled unintentionally, maybe by how you emphasize certain findings over others or by obscuring important details, or even just by using confusing charts.
So the presentation itself carries weight. It's not just the numbers.
Absolutely. How you frame it, how you visualize it, it all matters for clear communication.
Okay.
And third, remember that focus on the central research issue. This applies here too. You'll likely uncover interesting side findings, things that are cool but not directly related to your main question.
The tangential stuff we mentioned.
Yeah. Resist the urge to cram them into this report's findings section. Unless you're prepared to go back and fundamentally change your research scope, rewrite your purpose, your questions, everything, save those interesting tidbits for a separate paper or a future project.
Keep the main thing the main thing.
Exactly. Ultimately, clear, honest, focused reporting isn't just good practice. It reflects clear thinking. And it's what allows your research, assuming it was well conducted, to actually benefit others. If they can't understand what you found, the whole effort is kind of wasted, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Which leads perfectly into thinking about the readers. How should researchers specifically tailor their findings for their audience?
This is huge. You absolutely have to write for your audience. Think about who they are. What's their level of expertise on this topic? What are their perspectives likely to be? What do they actually need to know from your research?
So it's not one size fits all.
Not at all.
Yeah.
If you're writing for fellow experts in your niche field, you can probably use more technical jargon and assume a certain level of background knowledge. But if you're writing for policymakers or practitioners in the field, or maybe even a general audience,
You need to adjust.
significantly, you need to explain concepts more clearly, avoid overly specialized language, focus on the practical implications, ask yourself, what information does this specific group need to understand the significance of my findings and potentially act on them?
And maybe present it differently for different groups.
Sometimes, yes, you might have a main technical report and then create shorter summaries or briefs tailored to different audiences. And always be mindful of information overload. Don't just bury them in data. Highlight the key takeaways. Our source even suggests borrowing from journalism. Start with the most important stuff. Put the main finding, the headline, right up front, just like a news story leads with the most critical information. Don't make them wade through pages of methodology and minor results to get to the core message.
That's really practical advice. It's about being strategic in communication, not just accurate.
Exactly. It's about ensuring the message actually lands.
And that connects to overall readability, too. What are some concrete things researchers can do just to make the text itself easier to read and digest?
Yeah, the source gives some great practical tips here. Simple things, really, like varying your sentence structure and paragraph length. A wall of long, dense paragraphs is just intimidating.
Yeah, it makes your eyes glaze over.
Right. Use white space effectively. It makes the page look less crowded, more approachable. Keep sentences relatively short and clear, generally speaking. Use straightforward language.
And visual.
Clear, simple graphics are usually better than overly complicated ones. Sometimes it's smarter to break one complex chart into 2 or 3 simpler ones. Make sure they're well labeled and easy to understand at a glance.
What about things to avoid?
Well, try to minimize those long parenthetical statements that interrupt the flow. Avoid excessive technical jargon unless you immediately explain it or your audience definitely knows it.
Okay.
On the other hand, things like occasional personal illustrations, used judiciously of course, can make abstract points more concrete and relatable, and definitely use headings and subheadings frequently. They act like signposts, helping the reader navigate the text and see the structure.
It really sounds like putting yourself in the reader's shoes.
That's exactly it. It's about reader-centric writing.
And that flows into the next point.
Yeah.
Clear, direct writing style. How do we achieve that?
The source really pushes for clarity and conciseness. Use clear, easy-to-grasp sentences. Generally, favor the active voice over the passive voice.
Active voice example.
So instead of, the survey was administered by the research team, say, the research team administered the survey. It's usually more direct, more engaging.
Got it.
Start your paragraphs with a clear topic sentence. Tell the reader immediately what that paragraph is going to be about. It provides focus.
Like a mini headline for the paragraph.
Exactly. And keep sentences relatively concise. The source suggests aiming for under 2 lines long as a general guideline. It just improves processing and retention.
I mentioned something about smothered verbs. What's that?
Ah, yes. That's when you take a perfectly good verb and turn it into a clunky noun phrase, often using words like implementation, analysis, occurrence.
So instead of we analyze the data,
You might write, an analysis of the data was performed. Or instead of the plan was implemented, you get the implementation of the plan occurred. It just adds unnecessary words and sounds more, well, bureaucratic or overly academic. Using the direct verb is almost always stronger and clearer.
be direct, use the verb. Makes sense.
But about redundancy? Oh, that's a big one. Research writing can often be filled with unnecessary words and phrases that just pad things out. Our source argues most reports could probably be cut down significantly just by eliminating redundancy without losing any meaning.
Any examples of common redundant phrases?
Sure, things like, the reason why is because, you just need because. Or basic essentials, essentials are basic. Consensus of opinion, consensus is opinion. There's a whole list in the source, actually. Being concise forces you to be clearer.
It sounds like tightening up the language really helps.
Massively. It makes it easier to read, easier to understand, and frankly, more respectful of the reader's time.
And I guess clear writing also helps with the overall organization of the report.
Absolutely. They go hand in hand. If your sentences and paragraphs are clear and focused, the overall structure tends to become clearer, too. The source mentions 3 key aspects of good organization: continuity, sequence, and integration.
Okay, break those down. Continuity.
Continuity just means being consistent. Use the same key terms and definitions throughout the report. Don't suddenly switch terminology halfway through as it confuses the reader.
Makes sense.
Sequence. Sequence is about the logical flow. Does the order in which you present information make sense? Does each section build logically on the previous one? Using clear headings, subheadings, and transition words or phrases, furthermore, however, in contrast, helps establish that sequence.
And integration.
Integration means making sure all the pieces fit together into a unified whole. Every section, every paragraph, every finding should clearly contribute to addressing that central research issue and fulfilling the overall purpose of the study. It should feel cohesive, not like a collection of separate parts.
So consistency, flow, and everything tying back to the main goal.
You got it. That creates a strong, coherent report.
Let's talk about the actual language choice again. The source says keep it simple. Does that mean dumbing it down, especially in academic work?
Not at all. Simple, direct language doesn't mean simplistic thinking. It means clear communication. Even complex ideas can usually be expressed in straightforward terms. Avoiding unnecessary jargon or overly convoluted sentences doesn't diminish the rigor of your work. It actually makes it more accessible and potentially more impactful because more people can understand it.
Good point. What about using I or we?
The source advises using I if you're the sole author and describing actions you took. Using we is appropriate for co-authored work or sometimes, carefully, to include the reader, though that can be tricky. Generally, it advises avoiding the second person, you, unless you are directly addressing the reader in a specific context like we are doing right now in this conversation.
Okay. Any other language pitfalls to avoid?
Yeah, a few common ones. Avoid contractions like don't, can't. In formal research writing, spell them out. Steer clear of colloquialisms or slang. Puns are usually out of place. And be very careful about coining new words or jargon. Only do it if absolutely necessary, and if you do, define it clearly. Maybe even include a glossary if you have several new terms.
So maintain a professional but clear tone.
Exactly. And don't forget formatting tools. The source mentions bolding, italics, bullet points. numbered lists, those headings we discussed, and of course, graphics. These aren't just decoration, they break up the text and help highlight key information, making the whole thing much easier to scan and read.
Right, which brings us nicely to charts, graphs, and figures. Visual storytelling, basically. What's the key advice there?
A really interesting piece of advice from the source is to consider creating your visuals first, even before you write the main text describing them.
Really? Why?
Because the process of visualizing the data, creating the chart or graph, can actually help you, the researcher, to spot patterns, trends, and relationships that might not be obvious just from looking at raw numbers or tables. It can guide your analysis.
Well, that's counterintuitive, but makes sense.
Yeah.
Let the visualization drive the interpretation.
To some extent, yes. And once you have the visual, remember that it often creates the reader's first impression of that piece of data. So it needs to be really clear and ideally self-contained.
Self-contained.
Meaning, someone should be able to basically understand what the visual is showing just by looking at it, thanks to a clear title, clearly labeled axes, a legend if needed, and the source of the data if appropriate. All the necessary info should be right there on the visual.
Okay, and the text then explains it further.
Precisely. The text should explicitly refer to the visual, example as shown in Figure 3, and then explain what the reader should notice, interpret the patterns, and discuss the implications. Don't just plop a visual in and expect it to speak entirely for itself. The text and visuals need to work together.
Should I use graphs or tables?
Good question. The source suggests that graphs are generally better for showing trends, comparisons, and relationships quickly. Tables are better for presenting precise numerical values. If you're in doubt, a graph might be more impactful for the main text, and you could put the detailed table in an appendix if needed.
Are there specific types of graphs for specific data?
Oh, absolutely. Bar graphs are great for comparing quantities across different categories. Pie charts show parts of a whole. Though use them carefully, they can get cluttered. Line graphs are excellent for showing trends over time. Scatter plots show the relationship between two variables. Flowcharts illustrate processes. Venn diagrams show overlaps. The key is choosing the visual type that best represents the specific data and the point you want to make.
And the source had that really striking example about church attendance, right? Showing how the same data could look totally different depending on the graph.
Yes, that's a fantastic illustration of the ethical dimension of data visualization. They show hypothetical attendance numbers in a table, Table 7.
Okay.
If you plot that data on a standard line graph or bar chart, like their Figure 8, it looks like pretty steady, impressive growth. The numbers are going up consistently. But if you plot the exact same numbers on a semi-logarithmic graph, Figure 10, which shows the rate of change, the picture looks completely different. It reveals that while attendance was still growing, the percentage growth rate was actually slowing down year after year.
Wow. So one graph suggests great growth, the other suggests slowing momentum.
Exactly, from the same data. It really highlights how the researcher's choice of visualization method isn't neutral. It shapes the reader's interpretation. You have a responsibility to choose the representation that most accurately and honestly reflects the underlying reality of the data relevant to your research question.
That's a really powerful point about responsible presentation. It's not just about the numbers, but how you show them.
Absolutely. Which ties into another principle. Be specific.
How so?
Avoid vague language and generalizations. Use precise, definite, concrete terms whenever you can. Instead of saying, some researchers believe, if you know who they are, name them, if appropriate in context, maybe cite them. Don't just say most people felt. If your survey gave you a specific percentage, use the percentage.
No fuzzy language.
Right, and definitely avoid making sweeping claims like studies show or research proves without immediately backing it up with a specific citation or evidence from your findings. Be specific, be documented.
Got it. And the final point on language was about inclusivity.
Yes. It's basically about using language that is respectful and avoids bias, particularly gender bias. Modern academic style guides strongly encourage using inclusive language.
Like avoiding using he to refer to a generic person.
Exactly. Or using terms like mankind when you mean humanity. There are various strategies using plurals, researchers, they instead of a researcher he, using specific roles, the participant instead of assuming gender, or sometimes rephrasing the sentence altogether. It's about being mindful and respectful of everyone in your audience.
Yeah, okay. So let's try to pull all these threads together. If we were to summarize the absolute essence of the findings section, what would it be?
Okay, the absolute core is this. The findings section provides the evidence. It's the data, the results, the observations you systematically gathered and analyzed to directly address your central research issue, to answer your research questions, and to determine whether your hypotheses were supported or not.
The proof, essentially.
The proof. And good findings have certain characteristics. They're relevant, directly related to the issue, they have weight, they're substantial enough to matter, they're competent, derived from sound methods, they clearly separate fact from opinion, they come from your primary sources or data collection, and they all fit together logically.
And crucially.
While they form the only legitimate basis for your conclusions and recommendations, the findings section itself should not contain those conclusions or recommendations. Keep the evidence separate from the interpretation and the calls to action.
The source also had that final table, Table 8, as a kind of checklist.
Yes, that's a really useful tool. It visually connects the dots, showing how the findings section should directly relate back to every other part of your research. Design the purpose, the problem statement, the research questions, the methodology, the data analysis plan. It reinforces that idea of integration we talked about, everything working together towards a single goal. It's a great way to check if your findings section is properly aligned.
Okay, fantastic. So as we wrap up this deep dive on findings, what are the main things you hope our listener takes away from this?
I think the biggest things are understanding that findings are the specific evidence-based discoveries from your research tied directly to your methods and your central question, realizing the importance of organizing and reporting them logically, usually guided by those initial questions, grasping the ethical responsibility to be accurate, complete, and transparent, reporting everything relevant, even the inconvenient stuff. And finally, appreciating that clear communication, thinking about your audience, writing directly, using visuals effectively is absolutely essential if you want your research to actually make a difference.
That's great. And for you, the listener, hopefully, understanding these principles gives you a much sharper lens for looking at information everywhere. When you read an article, see a report, sit through a presentation, you can now ask better questions. Are these actual findings? Are they directly based on the methods described? Are they presented clearly and honestly? Knowing this stuff makes you a much more discerning, more critical consumer of knowledge.
Absolutely. You're better equipped to sort the solid information from the less solid.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. Think about the last piece of information you consumed that claimed to be based on some kind of research or data collection, maybe a news report, a blog post, a work document. Applying what we've discussed today, what were the actual findings being presented? How clearly were they connected to any stated methods? And how effectively and perhaps how ethically were they communicated? Just asking those questions can change how you see the information flying around us every day.